Like I said, Joe Biden was uniquely responsible for creating the system that we have now from the standpoint of criminal justice, from the standpoint of incentivizing the increase in cops and keeping people in prison sentence longer, this disparity between crack and cocaine, the bills like the Trans-Pacific Partnership that he was going to pass under Obama, or for that matter, NAFTA, things that cut wages and made jobs that much more difficult because they were shipping many of those jobs overseas. So it cut the base of the country itself. I'm making the point to you that it goes beyond just the issue of race. It directly intersects with this issue of class, and some people in the society having much, much more wealth than others, directly and tangibly linked to the origins of our society. Those things are never dealt with. Those things are never regarded honestly. We have moments like this where those things explode, but even when they explode, it's usually entirely looked through racial lens as opposed to the lens of how does class and race intertwine with this particular situation to make this situation happen or incentivize that situation to happen? What do we need to do as a society to lessen, to disincentivize actions like this? The point is, what is your society and why is it arranged in such a way where it produces these outcomes? Now, Joe Biden made the argument once before that he didn't care how people were organized. He didn't care what people grew up in or their hardships. He didn't care about the difficulties of their particular life that got them to the point where they were. Meaning, basically, I'm absolving society of blame. Despite the fact that everything that that person is, the hardest, worst person in the world from the standpoint of criminal justice, that person was still born, evolved, engaged with all of these elements of your society that made that person who that person was. It wasn't a situation where that person came out of a magical door. No, there was one thing after the next in the way that your society was arranged, the pressures, the mechanisms, the things that it gave priorities to versus the things that they didn't, the things that they wanted to invest in, that they cared about, versus the things, again, that they didn't. Or for that matter, even the things that your society implicitly tells you are valuable as opposed to others. If there is no response when a person is murdered, then implicitly, we are not equals. If there is no way for the legal system, the justice system, to accommodate my interests when somebody who looks like me or somebody who's in my family gets murdered by a cop, then again, we are not equal. That is a priority that is given to one group over another group, especially if there's a disproportionate number of people who are being killed in those various groups. If you're going to make an argument to me, which is Van Jones is about to make, then Van Jones, the one thing that Van Jones need to add to this is the issue of class. And that's the one thing that he leaves out of this. When you think of those people who got shot, there's some cases where class wouldn't matter. If Tamir Rice is in a different neighborhood playing with a toy gun, does he get murdered? On some level, that's class. On the other level, that's race, because that kid at 12 years old was seen as a threat. Within 2 seconds, his life was extinguished. I'm making the point that they're related. It's not one or the other. It's both, even though the Democratic Party often separates those things. In these protests that are taking place all across the United States, the one element that I really wish that people start bringing together and start communicating and start creating webs is around this notion that class and race are intrinsically linked. And if you're going to put that much emphasis, that much support in a party, blacks voted Democrat 91% under Hillary Clinton for nothing. You're dying, or we're dying 3 times as more disproportionately than our white counterparts. Those things have to do with upbringing or inequities in regards to health. Sometimes there are weaknesses either in high blood pressure or insulin or diabetes. Whatever those weaknesses are from the standpoint of the physical systems, those things we're not affected evenly. And we have a large number of people who are dying disproportionately, in part because they're working at the low-wage jobs that are pushed them out there, but in other part because they're just more susceptible to it from an illness standpoint. But what does that look like when you can fundamentally change a person's living situation where either by neighborhood, either by class, either by the resources that they would have at their disposal if certain things were covered like they are in European nations? I'm making the point that the argument that you're making here is correct, that Van Jones is making. But the other part of that needs to be added in order to give further context to many of these situations, because I still submit that while we couldn't have stopped all situations, Tamir Rice was going to be seen as a threat regardless, even though if he was in a different neighborhood, perhaps that threat level would have been mitigated. But by the same token, they might have killed him that much faster because they thought he shouldn't have been in a neighborhood with this gun. So they're linked. And it's a difficult thing. I don't want to repeat myself, but it must be understood in that way. And in our society, we don't. And so when events like this happen, no one says, well, wait a minute, if he had money in his pocket, he wouldn't have been selling loose cigarettes. Nobody brings that up. It's purely looked at through the lens of he was choked to death because he was black. In part, yes. In other part, maybe not. Predominantly, yes. But is there an element of that could have escaped this very specific fate with a class-based solution? And the answer is, of course, yes. Let's hear Van Jones talk about the white moderate. Now, in Van Jones making this argument, Van Jones pissed some people off. And many people who are Hillary supporters got mad at him saying, I'm not racist and I'm a Hillary supporter. I can't stand that thug. Talking about Van Jones, calling him a thug. Let's
so even the most liberal, well-intentioned white person has a virus in his or her brain that can be activated at an instant. And so what you're seeing now is a curtain falling away. It's not the racist white person who's in the Ku Klux Klan that we have to worry about. It's the white liberal Hillary Clinton supporter walking her dog in Central Park who would tell you right now, people like that, oh, I don't see race. Race is no big deal to me. I see us all as the same. I give to charities. But the minute she sees a black man who she does not respect or who she has a slight thought against, she weaponized race like she had been trained by the Aryan Nation. A Klans member could not have been better trained to pick up the police and pick up her phone and tell the police it's a black man, African-American man, come get him.
Now think about what he's saying for the moment, because he is making a good point. I have family members that were in relationships with white women where they threatened that they would basically call the cops and have those cops come to the house knowing that that's somewhat of a threat on that person's life, because we have an idea in our heads that that cop is not going to appreciate that black man laying up with that white woman. That white woman who's making that threat knows that and is willing to use the political system or our legal system to settle scores. Now, the same thing is true for my wife. She has a friend, a brother, same thing. I guess my point is, Van Jones clearly has a point. If there's a discrepancy in your society in regards to how force is dispensed, where some groups get certain deference in dealing with the cops and some groups not at all. Some groups have a higher propensity of being arrested for the exact same crime. Some groups get longer sentences for the exact same crime. Some groups, for a drug that's pretty much the same, get far, far, far longer sentences for those things. Well, I'm going to point to that and say, yeah, that's a racial element, and there's a racial dynamic to that makes this stuff miserable. Now, the catch here is the moment that you know that, and you understand that disparity of force is there in regards to the way that force gets dispensed between whether I call or whether I'm the object of that call versus somebody who is white who is making that call, or for the most part, the object of that call. You could see it in the protests. Look at the way that they engaged all of these protesters, rubber bullets, flashbang grenades, all of those things right off the bat. Whereas in the other protests, you had armed militiamen take over the Capitol, and the cops just stood by there and watched. No issue. No issue. So clearly, Van Jones has a point. Here's the catch, though. If you're in society and you know that that's there, that's a card that you have in your deck. Whether you use it or not, that card is in your deck. And that card can be played when that card needs to be played. Once you overcome this level of, oh God, you're a really shitty person to do something like that. If you overcome that hurdle, you can actually do that. And you would keep that card there just for the moment where something bothers you to the point where you can overcome that hurdle of, oh God, this is really a shitty thing to do to somebody. card is there, whether it's used or not. I think most people will have issues doing something like that. By the same token, that card is there, and let's not pretend that that's not used and that's not known. The other interesting thing is that everybody understood what was taking place. Meaning the thing that Van Jones is talking about, where the woman in the park was basically choking her dog to death, not having the dog on the leash like she was supposed to, but saying she was going to call the cops on the guy who said, put your dog on the leash. Now, both of these people are for the most part of the same class, but she understood that regardless of whatever his class is, the first thing they're going to see is the color of his skin, and they're going to engage in that way. Regardless of what the truth of that is, of what would have happened, the threat is there. Meaning the reality is less important than the threat itself and the threat being made. And that the fact that everybody understands what is taking place when she's making that phone call. Nobody turned around and said, why is she calling the cops like that? What does she expect the cops to do in this situation? No, everybody understood. Oh, wow, she's threatening that guy by basically people understanding that cops have a propensity to kill blacks, or at the very least have a higher propensity, even though they will also kill you or anybody else that gets in their way. In this very specific case, though, calling them in this way is a threat. The other part to this is class, and that's the part that Van Jones doesn't touch. The white moderate, if you're going to make that argument. Think for the moment of what Joe Biden has been doing. Joe Biden ran for 40 years locking up people in the criminal justice system, making longer sentences, making those sentences that much more harsh, that much more onerous, while simultaneously gutting social services and being perfectly willing to cut Social Security and cut these other services that people of color use. Well, everybody in the society uses them, but if you're talking about people who are at the lower end of the economic scale, if you're cutting the ability to eat, if you're cutting the ability for housing, or if you're cutting healthcare, well, those things are going to materially affect certain elements of the population more than others. Now, in doing so, don't you have to deal with those? And can you really ignore those issues of class when trying to engage issues of race? I would say the answer is no. Or whatever the vagaries of your society in regards to what we want to consider legacies of slavery or legacies of Jim Crow or legacies of racial behavior that we're trying to shake off as a society as we evolve. It is infinitely true that having money in your pocket, having resources, living in a decent dwelling, a decent house, where you don't necessarily have to worry about lead in your water, you're going to have lights on, you're going to be able to get access to medication, you're going to be able to send your kid to school without hundreds or tens of thousands of dollars. That's a different world. And dealing with those things produces better human beings. Think for the moment, what is a person? A person is not a thing unto itself, just floating in a void somewhere. That person is always somewhere and soaking in something. There's always an ideology, a point of view. Sometimes that stuff is just silent and goes unsaid, even though it's accepted almost as flesh to bone, like a fish in water. But something is taking place. Something of your society is being dumped into those individuals. What I'm getting at is, if those people are made whole, they have access to clean water, clean air, fresh foods. They have a sense of purpose and belonging in the job that they're doing, where they have agency and they feel like they're a part of something larger. Do those people turn out to be better people? Yes. Is that a societal and a structural thing where new neoliberal Democrats, once they got rid of the third way, these third way Democrats come in office, cut regulations, cut services, give more money to the rich in regards to tax cuts, with the money that you've taken from those services, either in the destruction of welfare or these kind of deals that these guys make, send it to the top. If you have 95% of the income gains that are going to the top 1%, where's the rest of the money to pay for the things that your society, meaning all of your society, and I'm saying this from the standpoint of class, where is the money coming from to cover those other things? And yes, people can say MMT and that Congress just makes that cash. But just from the basic politics that we have, where we're talking about money and we're talking about the way that money is spent and how you accrue money in regards to that type of stuff and how that money is spread out. If 95% of income gains are going to the top 1%, what does it mean for people's wages, for example? You can't disassociate class from race. And it shows itself either in housing communities, meaning where people live, in the salaries that those people get, in the jobs that those people take that may be on the front lines of an issue like the COVID-19 crisis, the wages and the depression in the wages, where people don't necessarily have the ability to advocate for themselves because they just need a job and now this job can take advantage of them. I'm just saying, our world can be different. And the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have basically lockstep created our system the way our system is, and now wring their hands when somebody gets killed by the incentives and the drivers that these guys put into the system to make it function in the way it functions. Yes, Van Jones, I like your statement. Add class. Like, share, and subscribe. Brett McKinney. Oh, thank you, Brett. I appreciate it, man. All right, guys. I'll see you guys tomorrow.